Attorney General Pam Bondi storms into court, only to face a judge's wrath. Fined for contempt after arriving late, she's ready to unleash her legal genius in a showdown that could shake the justice system. The courtroom buzzed with tension, a sea of reporters and onlookers craning their necks as the heavy oak doors swung open. Pam Bondi, the United States Attorney General, strode in, her heels clicking against the polished marble floor. Her face was a mask of determination, but her arrival was 20 minutes late, and the air in the room crackled with the judge's barely concealed irritation. The case was minor, a procedural oversight involving a misfiled document from her office during a high-profile opioid litigation. It was a clerical error, one that should have been a footnote in her storied career, but today it had dragged her into this small federal courtroom in Miami. Judge Raymond Caldwell, perched high on his bench, adjusted his glasses, and fixed Bondi with a steely glare. His reputation as a no-nonsense jurist preceded him, but so did whispers of his quick temper and tendency to favor theatrics over fairness. "Ms. Bondi," he began, his voice dripping with disdain, "do you believe the Attorney General is above the rules of this court?" The room fell silent, pens poised over notepads, cameras subtly adjusting their focus. Bondi straightened, her jaw tight, but she didn't flinch. She knew the weight of every eye on her, the weight of her title, and the weight of the moment. "I apologize for my tardiness, Your Honor," she said, her voice steady but firm. "I was delayed by an urgent call from the White House regarding a national security matter, a cyber attack targeting federal infrastructure." The explanation was delivered with precision, a reminder of the high-stakes world she navigated daily. But Caldwell wasn't impressed. He leaned forward, his lips curling into a smirk. "Excuses, Ms. Bondi? This court operates on punctuality, not privilege. You are fined $5,000 for contempt." A murmur rippled through the crowd. The fine was steep for a first offense, and the judge's tone suggested this was personal. Bondi's eyes narrowed, but she didn't react. Immediately. She'd faced tougher opponents, cartel lawyers, corporate titans, even hostile congressional panels. This judge, with his petty power play, was no match for her. Yet she felt the sting of his condescension, the way he seemed to relish her discomfort. She glanced at her legal team, a subtle nod passing between them. They knew her well enough to sense the shift in her demeanor. She was about to turn the tables. "Your Honor," Bondi said, stepping closer to the podium, her voice now carrying the weight of authority honed over decades. "With all due respect, I must question the impartiality of this ruling. The fine seems disproportionate to the offense, and your remarks suggest a bias that undermines the integrity of this proceeding." The courtroom gasped. It was a bold move, calling out a federal judge in his own domain. Caldwell's face reddened, his gavel twitching in his hand as if itching to strike. "You dare accuse this court of bias?" he snapped, his voice rising. "You're treading dangerous ground, Ms. Bondi." But Pam Bondi didn't back down. She'd built her career on standing firm, from her days as a tough-on-crime prosecutor in Florida to her current role as the nation's top law enforcement officer. She knew the law, and she knew when it was being twisted to serve ego rather than justice. "I'm not accusing, Your Honor," she replied, her tone calm but razor-sharp. "I'm observing. The record will show your comments leaned heavily on my title, rather than the facts of the case. That's a matter for review, wouldn't you? Agree?" The implication hung in the air, an appeal, a higher court scrutiny. Caldwell's smirk faltered just for a moment. The reporters scribbled furiously, sensing a story far bigger than a late arrival. Bondi's challenge wasn't just about this moment. It was a spark that could ignite a broader reckoning. She'd seen too many courtrooms where power trumped fairness, where judges wielded gavels like scepters. If Caldwell thought he could humiliate her, he'd underestimated her resolve. As the judge adjourned does not exist called a recess, Bondi stood her ground, her eyes locked on Caldwell's. The room felt smaller, the air thicker, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. What would the judge do next? Would he double down, or had Bondi's words already planted a seed of doubt? The courtroom doors swung shut as the recess began, but the tension lingered like a storm cloud. Reporters huddled in the hallway, their whispers buzzing with speculation about Pam Bondi's daring stand against Judge Caldwell. Inside, Bondi remained at the defense table, her legal team exchanging quiet glances. She could feel the weight of the moment, the eyes of the bailiff, the clerk, even the stenographer, all waiting for her next move. She wasn't just fighting a fine. She was challenging a system that too often shielded judges like Caldwell from accountability. Her pulse quickened, not from fear, but from the clarity of purpose that had driven her career. Caldwell returned to the bench, his face a mask of controlled fury. The recess had done little to cool his temper. He slammed his gavel, the sound echoing like a gunshot. "Ms. Bondi," he said, his voice low and deliberate, "your remarks before the break were dangerously close to contempt again. I suggest you choose your words carefully." The threat was clear, but Bondi didn't flinch. She rose, her posture commanding, her eyes meeting his without hesitation. "Your Honor," she said, "I choose my words with the same care I apply to upholding the law. My concern is not personal. It's about ensuring this court operates without prejudice." The room stirred, onlookers leaning forward. Caldwell's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone with Bondi's stature. As Attorney General, she wielded influence that could ripple far beyond this courtroom, and he knew it. "You speak of prejudice," he countered, "yet you disrupt my court with theatrics. This is about a misfiled document, not a crusade." His words were meant to diminish her, to paint her as an opportunist. But Bondi saw through the tactic. She'd faced men like Caldwell before, powerful, entrenched, convinced their authority was unassailable. "With respect, Your Honor," Bondi replied, her voice steady but edged with steel. "The issue is not the document, it's the pattern. Your fine was disproportionate, your tone dismissive. The record shows you've imposed similar penalties disproportionately on certain attorneys. Women, minorities, those who challenge you." A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Bondi had done her homework. As Attorney General, she had access to data, and her team had spent the recess pulling court records. Caldwell's rulings showed a troubling trend, one she wasn't afraid to expose. The judge's face darkened, his hands gripping the bench. "You're out of line, Ms. Bondi," he snapped. "This court will not be slandered by baseless accusations." But his voice wavered, betraying a flicker of unease. Bondi pressed her advantage, her tone calm but unrelenting. "They're not baseless, Your Honor. I can provide the data. Case numbers, dates, outcomes. Would you like me to submit them into evidence?" The challenge hung in the air, a gauntlet thrown. Reporters scribbled faster, their pens scratching like a chorus of insects. This wasn't just a story now, it was a scandal in the making. Caldwell hesitated, a rare crack in his composure. He could feel the room shifting, the weight of scrutiny bearing down. Bondi's words weren't just for him. They were for the cameras, the public, the higher courts that might review this case. She was turning his courtroom into a stage, and he was losing control. "Enough!" he barked, raising his gavel. "This hearing is about your conduct, not mine. I'm doubling the fine to $10,000. The crowd erupted in murmurs, phones buzzing as journalists tweeted the escalation. Bondi's team exchanged looks of alarm, but she remained, unflinched, her mind racing. She knew she was pushing Caldwell to the edge, but retreat wasn't an option. This wasn't about her pride. It was about exposing a flaw in the system. She'd seen too many defendants, too many attorneys, silenced by judges who wielded power, without oversight. If she could shine a light on Caldwell's bias, she could spark change. But the judge wasn't done. He leaned forward, his voice a venomous whisper. "Keep this up, Ms. Bondi, and you'll find yourself in citation, in jail." The threat was clear, but so was Bondi's resolve. As the courtroom held its breath, what would Caldwell do next? Had Bondi pushed him too far, or was this the moment that would redefine justice? The courtroom froze, Judge Caldwell's threat hanging like a guillotine. Pam Bondi stood motionless, her eyes locked on his, the silence so thick it seemed to choke the air. His words, jail, were a brazen escalation, a judge wielding his authority like a club. But Bondi, the Attorney General, was no stranger to high-stakes battles. She'd faced down cartels, corrupt officials, and political firestorms. Caldwell's threat didn't intimidate her. It fueled her. She knew this moment could either break her or break open a system rotten with unchecked power. "Your Honor," Bondi said, her voice calm but carrying the weight of a prosecutor about to deliver a closing argument. "Threatening incarceration for raising legitimate concerns about judicial conduct crosses a line. It's not just an abuse of power. It's a violation of the principles this court claims to uphold." The words landed like a thunderclap. Reporters' pens flew across, notepads capturing every syllable. The onlookers, from attorneys to spectators, leaned forward, sensing the confrontation spiraling into something historic. Caldwell's face flushed crimson, his knuckles whitening around his gavel. "You will not lecture me in my own courtroom," he roared, slamming the gavel so hard the sound reverberated off the walls. "You're here for a misfiled document, yet you've turned this into a circus. I hold you in contempt. Again." The fine was now irrelevant. This was personal. He pointed a trembling finger at Bondi. "One more word, and I'll have the bailiff escort you out in cuffs." The bailiff shifted uneasily, glancing between the judge and Bondi, clearly reluctant to act. Bondi didn't blink. She knew Caldwell was unraveling, his composure crumbling under the scrutiny she'd forced upon him. Her team had already flagged. His rulings, data showing he'd disproportionately fined and sanctioned female and minority attorneys over minor infractions. The evidence was damning, and she wasn't about to let him silence her. "Your Honor," she said, her tone measured but unyielding, "if you believe restraining me will erase the questions I've raised, you're mistaken. The record speaks for itself, and so will the appeals court." The mention of an appeal sent a ripple through the room. Caldwell's eyes widened, a flicker of panic betraying his bravado. An appeal would mean oversight, investigators poring over his rulings, his conduct, his biases laid bare. Bondi had turned his threat into a trap, and he was caught in it. "You think you can intimidate this court?" he spat, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. He glanced at the reporters, their cameras trained on him, and for the first time, he seemed to feel the weight of their gaze. Bondi seized the moment, her voice rising with quiet authority. "This isn't about intimidation, Your Honor. It's about accountability. You've doubled my fine, threatened jail, and dismissed evidence of bias without review. If that's justice, then this system needs a mirror held up to it." The courtroom erupted in murmurs, some nodding in agreement, others stunned by her audacity. Even her legal team, seasoned attorneys themselves, exchanged looks of awe. Bondi wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for every attorney who'd faced Caldwell's wrath, every defendant who'd been steamrolled by his gavel. Caldwell slammed his gavel again, desperate to regain control. "Silence!" he bellowed, but the room only grew louder, the buzz of whispers and rustling papers drowning out his command. He leaned back, his chest heaving, realizing he'd lost the narrative. Bondi stood tall, her presence commanding despite the chaos. She'd planted a seed, and it was already taking root. Outside, news vans were arriving, tipped off by reporters live tweeting the showdown. This was no longer a minor hearing. It was a national story. But Caldwell wasn't finished. His eyes narrowed, a dangerous glint returning. "Ms. Bondi," he said, his voice low and menacing. "You want to play this game? I'll adjourn this hearing and recommend a formal inquiry into your conduct as Attorney General." The threat was a desperate counterpunch aimed at her career, her legacy. Bondi's heart raced, but her face remained impassive. Had she pushed too far, or was Caldwell's desperation her greatest weapon? As the gavel fell, signaling another recess, the question hung in the air, unanswered. The gavel's echo faded, but the courtroom remained charged, as if the air itself carried the weight of Judge Caldwell's threat. Pam Bondi stood at the defense table, her expression unreadable, though her mind raced. An inquiry into her conduct as Attorney General wasn't just a jab. It was a calculated strike at her career, her reputation, everything she'd built over decades. Caldwell's words were a desperate gambit, but a dangerous one, and the glint in his eyes told her he wasn't bluffing. Outside, the hallway buzzed with reporters, their phones lighting up with breaking news alerts. "Judge threatens AG Bondi with inquiry." The stakes had never been higher. As the recess stretched on, Bondi's legal team huddled around her, their voices low but urgent. "He's overreaching," said her deputy, a sharp-eyed attorney named Carla Reyes. "An inquiry recommendation from him won't hold water, but it'll make headlines." Bondi nodded, her jaw tight. She knew the game: smear her name, shift the narrative, make her the villain. But she'd faced worse. As a prosecutor, she'd taken on mob bosses. As Attorney General, she'd battled corporate giants. Caldwell's courtroom was just another arena, and she wasn't about to cede ground. When the hearing resumed, Caldwell swept back to the bench, his robes billowing like a storm cloud. The room hushed, every eye on Bondi as she rose, her posture defiant. "Your Honor," she began, her voice cutting through the silence, "your threat of an inquiry is noted. But let's be clear. This isn't about my conduct. It's about a judge using his bench to silence dissent. If you want an inquiry, I welcome it, into this courtroom's practices." The crowd gasped, the boldness of her counterattack stunning, even her allies. She was doubling down, turning Caldwell's weapon against him. Caldwell's face twisted, his composure fraying. "You're delusional, Ms. Bondi," he snapped. "You think you can waltz in here, late, disrespectful, and lecture me about my court?" His voice rose, cracking with indignation. "I've served this bench for 20 years. You're the one under scrutiny now." He leaned forward, his eyes boring into hers. "I'm filing a formal complaint with the Judicial Conduct Committee. Let's see how your title holds up then." The threat landed like a grenade, and the courtroom erupted in whispers. Reporters typed furiously, live streaming the showdown to a growing audience. Bondi didn't flinch, though her pulse thundered. She knew Caldwell's complaint could trigger months of investigations, political attacks, maybe even calls for her resignation. But she also knew his desperation was a crack in his armor. "File your complaint, Your Honor," she said, her tone icy but controlled. "But I'm submitting my own, to the same committee. Your rulings show a pattern of bias, and I have the data to prove it. Let's see whose conduct holds up." The room fell silent, the weight of her words sinking in. She'd called his bluff, raising the stakes to a level neither could back down from. Caldwell's hands trembled, his gavel hovering as if he wanted to smash it through the bench. "You're playing a dangerous game," he hissed, his voice barely audible. "This court will not be your soapbox." But Bondi saw the fear in his eyes, the fear of exposure, of losing the power he'd wielded so freely. She pressed her advantage, her voice rising with conviction. "This isn't a game, Your Honor. It's about justice. If your courtroom can't withstand scrutiny, that's not my failure. It's yours." The words struck like a whip, and even the bailiff shifted uncomfortably, sensing the tide turning. Outside, the story was exploding. News outlets ran headlines. A.G. Bondi accuses judge of bias in explosive courtroom clash. Social media buzzed with clips of her defiance, her words resonating with those who'd long felt the legal system favored the powerful. But Caldwell wasn't done. As the session neared its end, he leaned back, a sly smile creeping across his face. "Ms. Bondi," he said, his voice dripping with menace, "you've made your point, but this hearing isn't over. Tomorrow we'll address your contempt charges, fully." The gavel fell, and the room held its breath. What did Caldwell have planned? Was this his final trap, or had Bondi's courage already set justice in motion? The courtroom emptied, but the echo of Judge Caldwell's final words lingered like a storm warning. Pam Bondi stood at the defense table, her face a mask of resolve as her team gathered their files. His promise to fully address her contempt charges tomorrow wasn't just a procedural note, it was a threat, laced with the smug confidence of a man who believed he still held the upper hand. Outside, the Miami courthouse was a circus. News vans lined the street, reporters shouted questions, and protesters, some supporting Bondi, others decrying her, waved signs. The clash had gone viral, with Dodard Bondi's Caldwell trending nationwide. But Bondi knew the real battle was still ahead. In her hotel room that night, Bondi barely slept. Her phone buzzed with messages from allies in Washington, warning her of the political fallout. Caldwell's complaint to the Judicial Conduct Committee could paint her as reckless, a loose cannon unfit for her role. Yet she also knew her own complaint against him, backed by data showing his biased rulings, had rattled him. She'd spent hours with her team, combing through court records, emails, even old case files. They'd found a pattern. Caldwell had a history of targeting attorneys who challenged him, especially those who didn't fit his mold of deference. Tomorrow she'd need to be sharper than ever. The next morning the courtroom was packed, the air electric with anticipation. Reporters crammed the benches, their cameras trained on Bondi as she entered, her navy suit crisp, her expression unyielding. Caldwell took the bench, his face a study in controlled malice. "Ms. Bondi," he began, his voice smooth but venomous, "yesterday you turned a simple hearing into a spectacle. Today we address your contempt. 3 counts, each carrying potential jail time." The room gasped. 3 counts? It was an escalation beyond reason, a clear attempt to crush her. Bondi's heart pounded, but she kept her gaze steady. "Your Honor," she said, rising, her voice clear and commanding, "these charges are retaliatory. They stem not from my actions, but from my refusal to be silenced. Your record shows a pattern of punishing those who question your authority. Data I've already submitted to the Judicial Conduct Committee." The crowd murmured, and Caldwell's eyes flashed with fury. He slammed his gavel. "Enough!" he roared. "You will not hijack this court again. I'm prepared to sentence you now, unless you retract your accusations." It was an ultimatum, a demand for submission. Bondi stood, taller, her resolve hardening. "I retract nothing," she said, her words ringing through the room. "The truth doesn't bend to threats. If you sentence me, you'll only prove my point, that this courtroom values power over justice." The audience erupted, some cheering, others shouting in protest. Caldwell's face turned ashen, his control slipping. He'd expected her to back down, to preserve her career. Instead, she was daring him to act, knowing every move was being recorded, dissected, broadcast. "Order!" Caldwell bellowed, his gavel pounding. "Ms. Bondi, you leave me no choice. I sentence you to 3 days in custody for contempt." The room exploded. Reporters surged forward, spectators gasped, and Bondi's team leapt to their feet, objecting. The bailiff hesitated, clearly uneasy, but moved toward Bondi. She held up a hand, her eyes never leaving Caldwell's. "Do it," she said, her voice calm but defiant. "But know this, every second I'm in custody will amplify the call for your accountability." The bailiff paused, glancing at Caldwell, who nodded curtly. As the bailiff approached, Bondi's deputy, Carla Reyes, stepped forward, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Your Honor, we're filing an emergency appeal with the 11th Circuit. This sentence is unlawful, and we have precedent." The move was a lifeline, but Caldwell wasn't swayed. "File what you want," he sneered. "This court's authority stands." But his voice shook, betraying his unease. The cameras caught every moment, and outside the crowd grew louder, chanting Bondi's name. She'd turned his trap into a rallying cry. As the bailiff reached for her arm, Bondi's eyes locked on Caldwell's. Was this his breaking point? Or had she just lit a fuse that would burn his courtroom down? The courtroom teetered on the edge of chaos as the bailiff's hand hovered near Pam Bondi's arm, Judge Caldwell's sentence hanging like a guillotine. The crowd's chants outside, "Justice for Bondi," seeped through the walls, a rising tide of defiance. Bondi's eyes remained fixed on Caldwell, her gaze a silent challenge, daring him to follow through. His sneer faltered, the tremor in his voice betraying a man who sensed his grip on power slipping. Carla Reyes' announcement of an emergency appeal had shifted the ground beneath him, and the cameras, relentless, captured every crack in his facade. This wasn't just a hearing anymore. It was a reckoning. Before the bailiff could act, a sharp voice cut through the din. "Your Honor, we object." It was Reyes, stepping forward, a tablet in hand. "We've just received confirmation. The 11th Circuit has granted an emergency stay of your sentence, pending review." The room erupted, gasps, shouts, reporters scrambling to relay the news. Bondi's lips twitched, the faintest hint of a smile, but she held her composure. Caldwell's face drained of color, his gavel frozen mid-air. "That's impossible," he stammered, but the truth was undeniable. The higher court had intervened, and Bondi's team had outmaneuvered him. "You've overstepped, Your Honor," Bondi said, her voice steady, resonant. "This sentence, like your fines, was retaliation, not justice. The 11th Circuit agrees, and so will the Judicial Conduct Committee when they review your record." The crowd roared, some spectators clapping, others jeering Caldwell. He slammed his gavel, desperate to regain control, but the sound was drowned out by the chaos. "This court is adjourned," he bellowed, rising so quickly his robes tangled. He fled to his chambers, the door slamming behind him. Bondi remained at the defense table, unshaken, as her team surrounded her. Reyes whispered, "We've got him. The committee's already requesting his case logs." Outside, the chants grew louder, news anchors reporting live. A.G. Bondi freed as judge's ruling overturned. The story had transcended the courtroom, igniting debates on judicial bias, power, and accountability. Social media exploded with support for Bondi, her defiance resonating with millions who'd felt the sting of an unfair system. But for Bondi, this was personal. She'd faced Caldwell's wrath and turned it into a weapon for change. In the weeks that followed, the fallout was swift. The Judicial Conduct Committee launched a full investigation into Caldwell's courtroom, uncovering a trail of biased rulings, disproportionate sanctions against women and minority attorneys, rushed judgments against marginalized defendants. The data Bondi's team had compiled became the cornerstone of the probe. Caldwell was suspended, his career in tatters, as headlines branded him a symbol of judicial overreach. Bondi, meanwhile, became a beacon of reform. Her testimony before Congress detailing her ordeal spurred bipartisan support for systemic changes: mandatory bias training for judges, oversight committees to monitor courtroom conduct, and stricter penalties for judicial misconduct. The Miami courthouse, once Caldwell's fiefdom, became a testing ground for these reforms. Bondi's minor hearing, sparked by a misfiled document, had unraveled a web of injustice. She returned to her role as Attorney General with renewed purpose, Her reputation not just intact but elevated. At a press conference, she spoke plainly. This wasn't about me. It was about every person who's faced a gavel wielded like a weapon. Justice demands accountability, at every level. The crowd applauded, cameras flashing as her words echoed across the nation. Months later, Bondi stood outside the same courthouse, now adorned with a plaque honoring the reforms her stand had inspired. The air was warm, the sky clear, and for the first time in a long time she felt a quiet satisfaction. Caldwell was gone, his bench occupied by a judge trained under the new guidelines. The system wasn't perfect, but it was better, because she'd refused to back down. As she walked away, a young attorney approached, eyes wide with admiration. "You changed everything," she said. Bondi smiled, her voice soft but firm. "No. We did." The fight was over, but its impact would endure, a testament to one woman's courage in the face of a system that dared to silence her.